Do we have people on with us?
Oh,
Yes, we have
got
60
people,
people.
but we should have
How many?
160, but we should have 120
Wow.
or 100 more.
Okay.
Right. So we can't.
That's a huge audience. Holy cow,
Yeah.
for one of these
You
deals,
won't-
60 people?
You
Wow.
won't be able to see them because it's a webinar format. But if you wanted to hit your chat icon at the bottom, sometimes people will make comments in the chat.
Okay,
but
so I
what we're
can't
gonna-
see them.
Right.
Right. Yeah, we can't see them either. We see that there are 66 people, which
Can they hear us now?
yes,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
yes they
yeah.
can. So
And so I'm going to get this show on
we're
the
going to
road.
get started at 6:01.
And I want to welcome everybody to Retake Our Democracy Zoominar with Joe Monahan. I'm going to dispense with the usual banter and, talk about events and things like that, because we got Joe for only an hour. So we're going to ask him questions for 30 minutes and then pass it over to you attendees, and you can ask the really hard questions. And then the other thing is the one statement I'd like to make before we get started is we always like to acknowledge that we're doing this show, this Zoominar, on stolen Tewa land, and we want to thank our Tewa neighbors for their being such good stewards of the land, and may we learn from them. I'm in the midst of reading Nick Estes' book, and he our past is our future, will be our future, something like that. It's a brilliant book, and it's all obviously about Indigenous history. So with that,
I just want to say, I know many of you have been on these Zoominars with us in the past, so you know the routine, but feel free to use the chat to comment and exchange ideas with other attendees, but we are not using the chat for Q&A. Use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to post any questions you want to ask Joe or Paul or any of the three of us. If you don't see that icon, just take your cursor and hover down toward the bottom of your screen, and you should see several icons popping up. So use Q&A to ask your questions. And as Paul said, we have a set of questions that we're going to ask first for the first half hour, and then we'll go to the participant questions in the second half hour.
okay, so first question for you, Joe. What do you see as the single greatest problem with the legislative process? And can volunteer lobbyists or activists do anything about it?
That's all. That's probably a multifaceted question for most people. But first of all, I want to thank you for having me. I didn't expect we have such a big crowd. I thought it was going to be Roxanne and Paul and maybe a handful of others, but you've done a great job assembling a lot of concerned people. And I do enjoy your take on the legislature. I think you guys do a much better job than most of us, because you're so dedicated to the inner workings, the sausage making, if you will, as Paul might put it. And I appreciate everything you've done. And I don't always agree with you. And of course, they don't always agree with me. I've been on that blog now nearly 20 years. And I'll tell you, make a lot of friends, but you also make a lot of not so friends. But
oh, yes, we know that.
We all understand that, because I think we all care. And when you care, you're going to make passionate commitments. And that's what it's all about. And the dialogue is very important. So again, thanks for having me, and for all the anonymous participants out there. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Well, what's wrong with the legislature? It's funny you asked that question, because in years past, I often talked about that. But actually, this time around, there is a lot that is right with the legislature. I mean, let's look at what's happened here. I mean, the last 10 years before today were about what could not be done in Santa Fe, all through the dark years of Governor Martinez, the chairmanship of Senate Finance Committee Chairman John Arthur Smith, an industrious, hardworking, decent man, but one I happen to disagree with strongly on the fiscal direction of the state. We really didn't have much to talk about. The legislature was decided. Marijuana, oh yeah, we'll talk about that. It's dead. Go back to, cockfighting. That took 10 years, dead. That was back in Bill Richardson's day. But my point being, in the last 8 years, it's been, getting halfway on the dance floor with the state house passing stuff, and the thing being automatically dead in the Senate. So there was no chance for any Never mind progressive legislation. I just like to call it forward-thinking legislation for our state. This year, I felt the floodgates, if they weren't broken, there was certainly a lot of big rivers formed through them in terms of the legislation that was passed. And for the first time in many years, I enjoyed watching this legislature and watching the debates and talking about how we could improve New Mexico, because folks, that's a giant change in the narrative. And, you know, when I started on the blog in 2003, we were in a similar period with Governor Richardson, where we were having a discussion about moving the state forward, about what was wrong with the state, but uplifting the state while we did it. And in these past 8 years, it's just been government doesn't work, things are not going to change. And we were at loggerheads like they were in Washington, D.C. So from that perspective, the legislative process works. The election process worked. It broke the logjam in the June 2020 election cycle, with Senator Smith and the other heavyweights going away. There's nothing complicated about this. Legislation is for the lawyers. They can get complicated about it and dot the I's and T's, but when it comes to political progress, it's about elections. And we had the election. Now we've got the results. Now it's not going to be perfect. Everybody's not going to be satisfied. But when you look at what was accomplished, Paul and Roxanne, on some long-term situations that you and I and others tuned in today have talked about, it was like, hey, what went right with the legislature? So I'll answer your question that way to kick it off.
Okay.
Yeah, and we acknowledge that 2 years ago, we have bills that we support, and we put the lists out there. These are the bills we're supporting. We can't support all the great legislation, but less than a third of what we were supporting was passed. And this time it was, I think, a little over half. So definitely some progress.
Congratulations, because getting half of your bills passed, that's just remarkable compared to what I'm sure you had been through in the last 8, 9, 10 years. When we had this gridlock with the state Senate unable to report out any legislation. So I think that one of the things I was most disappointed in was and I think you've talked about this, is the payday loan. I thought we might sneak that through with the 35% interest rates rather than these heinous rates of 375. We got it down to 175, and now we were supposed to compromise at 99. I think that still shows 99% for a $100 loan at the payday loan stones, for those not familiar. But I think that shows that we've got a long way to go in really incorporating some of these economic ideas that New Mexico badly needs. And that's one of them. That speaks to an exploitative citizenry out there in the 21st century. And I think we dropped the ball on that one. Would be my thoughts.
Yeah. So let me ask you the next question, Joe. You wrote probably back in March, early March, about new legislators, freshman legislators being oriented, we say indoctrinated. I don't know if you used that word, but by what is a fiscally conservative legislative council service, legislative financial counsel, David Abbey. That really seems to trim their wings or narrow their vision about what's possible. So can you just talk a little bit about that, and what, is that going to continue happening? Do we need to get new people in those leadership positions to stop that or change that?
Well, what I didn't actually write that, but a reader of mine with very long experience wrote this column, and I usually don't run a column of that length, but I edited it down. I found it such a brilliant analysis. It kind of eluded me over the years on how to phrase it exactly. The Legislative Finance Committee is tied up and controlled by fiscal austerity people, as most economic panels throughout the government of the United States are. It's the nature of the beast. But in New Mexico, it's been particularly perturbing because of the lack of capital circulating, the need for more money and investment. And that author of that, I'll call one of my senior sources, worked with all of this process for many years. And he said, that's just the way it comes about. It's not like it's Area 51 and the new legislators gather and there's a big conspiracy to make them all fiscally conservative. It's just in our DNA. You know, by way of history, the LFC, which is really a wonderful organization because it was founded in the 50s to provide a counterbalance to the executive budget. So New Mexico is one of the few states in the union that has countervailing budgets, one from the legislature, one from the governor. And I kind of like that. I think, you know, we've always had this predilection in New Mexico sometimes to overcheck the executive, but in this case, I really enjoy it. But I haven't enjoyed the outcome from the fiscal impact reports, which that writer was talking about, and the conservative bent that they lend to legislation. They become very powerful. And I think that if you look at the election of 2020, it was bursting at the seams for change. And it showed how the fiscal power of the LFC has been ingrained, even as we've had this big change in the thinking of the electorate to a more centrist and, may I dare say, even a centrist left perspective, rather than this center right perspective that prevailed really up until 2007 or 8 after Richardson left. Then we had the economic collapse and everything kind of changed in New Mexico. Media, the economy, the political faces, the moving out of people, the lack of opportunity, the increasing poverty from 48th to 50th, the crime. I could go on and on about what a sea change we experienced after 2008 and why we needed a much more liberal slant or progressive slant in the legislature and in our politics, and we didn't get it. And we saw why we didn't get it, because of that institutionalization of fiscal austerity. But thanks to people like you and others, you chipped away at the wall and we got some new faces in there, new thinking. It's not like we got a bunch of radical spenders. We've just got people who are open to the argument and open to doing things rather than saying no, as we used to call one of the senators, Dr. No. So that's the LFC, a presence that is just respected and intimidating if you're a new person. Say you're a part-time, you're in real estate business or whatever, you want to serve the community, you go up there, they say, this is how it is, and you better do it right, or our bond rating is going to be affected. And I'm not, implying there's some duplicitousness by the LFC. They're good people who believe what they're doing. And Dr. David Abbey is a friend. He's a great guy. He's very helpful. But I think that we saw what, in 2 words, happened this time: elections matter, and the LFC was somewhat tamed.
Great. I just want to remind our attendees to use the Q&A for your questions. We're not monitoring the chat for questions. We're going to take them off of the Q&A about 30 minutes in.
And Joe, just to update you, got 99 folks on right now.
Oh, so fantastic. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. I'm honored to be here, and it's been fun so far, so don't get too rough on me.
Okay, well, this is an easy one. In our 2019 legislative report card, Retake zeroed in on the inordinate impact that specific committee chairs had on the legislative process, and how bills didn't necessarily die by being voted down on the chamber floor or committee floor. They died by virtue of never getting a hearing. And we saw that in spades in Senate Judiciary this year, where 100 bills died, several of ours. Is there any remedy for that?
Well, I don't know if there's a remedy. It's just the pragmatist in me says, this is our democratic process. When you go to the state Senate or go to the state House, you want to be able to use power. That's what politics is, the use of power. And the longer you stay there, the system rewards those who accumulate seniority. And really, if you can't accumulate seniority and you can't accumulate power, what are you doing there? So it's kind of a catch we're in here, because if you get a guy like who you don't agree with as committee chair, you could be frozen out for a long time. So I don't think that system changes. I think it's probably doing what it's supposed to do, which is putting in very experienced and more erudite lawmakers with a broader view of life after being in the legislature for 7, 8, 9, or 10 years. They should be the chair of the committee. They're the most knowledgeable. They know the staff. They know the issues. But if they become intransigent and power hungry, you have the remedy that you have is what, again, I keep going back to these kind of landmark elections in the June primary, Paul, where you took out all these conservative senators, also, or conservative moderate senators, and also the ability of the public in the individual districts to put pressure on them. The system has avenues to correct a power-hungry chairman, but I think the New Mexican public, or all of us, have been a little lax maybe in doing so, particularly in the last 8 or 9 years when we saw what needed to be done in the state, and we really didn't. Maybe all of us could have tried a little harder to say, hey, you need to lighten up and get this show moving in a different direction, because our people are hurting.
Yeah, so we have a comment in the chat about using acronyms that people aren't familiar with. So what did we use? Legislative Finance, LFC, that's Legislative Finance.
Legislative Finance Committee.
Yeah, and we talked about, I don't know.
Oh.
Sorry, we'll just try to avoid doing that because it's important that you understand what we're talking about. Okay, next question.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Are you ready? Okay, so given that situation that we just talked about, how bills do get sort of log jam in certain committees, has there ever been any kind of effort to limit the number of bills legislators can introduce? I know they talked about it this year because of the COVID, but if they did say, okay, each legislator can introduce about 5 bills, that would be 500 bills instead of 2,000 or 3,000. So has that ever been discussed that you know of?
Well, I think the House this year, my understanding is, did limit it to 5 for the first time in my memory. The Senate, I think, did not abide by that limitation. So we had the fewest bills at a legislative session that we've ever had in my recent memory. So that, I think Speaker Egoff has talked about continuing that. Now, whether you can get away with that in the future is another matter, but we've done a pretty good job of weeding out the memorials, National Cookie Day, and let's introduce the rodeo guys from Tucumcari. And because we do have a somewhat short session, 60 days, and then the 30-day sessions in the odd years, I believe. So I think that a lot of the legislation is just really remedies of previous legislation and doesn't get in the way. We had a big session of big bills. The land grant permanent school fund is going to go to the voters. That's huge. That's history changing. Yep. If they allow that kind of money into very early childhood for brain development and child development, and in this atmosphere of terrible educational rankings, we've been working for this for how long? I've worked with Alan Sanchez at Chi St. Joseph's for a decade on that. And it was just like banging your head against the wall. And then we got that because of the new Senate and because of the stick-to-itiveness of the House. We've got expansion of the low-income tax credit and the working families tax credit. Plus, we got a $600 grant to those eligible for one of those credits because of the pandemic, to boost them up. We really invested. We gave some more pay raises, I believe, Roxanne, to our state teachers. We managed to increase funding for the universities a little. Some may argue, well, first let them clean up their athletic departments. But I mean, when I go to the land grant permanent school fund and I go to the tax credits for the working class families that were approved, the federal impact aid that was being taken away from the Indian country for their public education system, huge. They're going to get $60 million a year. There's not that many people out there. $60 million is going to go a long way. It's not like Albuquerque. They don't have that many people. But so we had some really successful legislation. My complaint, we always have them because we're trying to make things better. I think there should have been more focus on broadband instead of the bill that was passed that we're going to study it for 3 years and we only put 130 million in it. We need to take that reserve down to like 12 or 13, not 17 or 18%. There we go back to that fiscal austerity that's still very powerful, including with our governor, who described herself as a fiscal conservative during her initial gubernatorial campaign 4 years ago. But I don't think the bills, the number of bills themselves is really that much of a problem. It's still controlled. The speaker controls the flow in the House. The majority leader and the pro tem control it in the Senate, and they can weed it down pretty fast. You saw what happened in that special session, right? Bang, bang, bang.
Right.
I mean, they got that marijuana thing. When they want to move, they can move. The same thing in Washington, and I've worked there on Capitol Hill. We could never get it done. And then all of a sudden, Reagan comes in, and in 2 days you get, something happening explosively fast. So it's just it's the system that we have, and the pressure points to make it better are on those leadership figures. Like, hey, don't waste time on this. And
Yeah. So related to that, I mean, what are your thoughts about a paid legislature? We definitely support that, and we think it could solve a lot of the issues. A part of, having a paid staff that can help you research legislation, and just being, if the legislature were paid, we'd have more working class people in the legislature, people who could afford to do that. And right now they can't. So what are your thoughts about paid legislature? And do you ever think we're going to get it? I think it did pass once, and then the voters rejected it, right?
Yeah, same here. My internet connection is unstable. Well, not me, my internet connection, but anyway, I heard most of that. Well, you need a constitutional amendment in order to get a full-time paid legislature. And New Mexico, my understanding, is the last one in the nation that does not have a full-time paid one. But we do have per diem, which is what, about 175 a day, Paul, I think, or something. So if you live in Santa Fe and you stay at your house, actually you are kind of a paid legislator, because what are you spending $175 on? You can go down to the grocery store and eat at home and stay at home. But for many of the other legislators, it is a problem. There probably should be some kind of a paid legislature, lengthening the sessions. The problem, those of us who have been following this thing for a while, is they all wait for the last 3 days. So say we have a 100-day session. We're still going to wait for the last 3 days? I don't think that we really need more time, but I do agree that I think that we need to broaden the base of people who can participate in the process, rather than self-employed professionals such as lawyers, doctors, and real estate people, and all that kind of thing. How about some more paid salary people who might be able to get some time off and able to do it? Maybe you pay them $45,000. It's kind of a quasi part-time salary, because you're not really full-time. But I would love to see it. But again, getting that constitutional amendment, that will be hard, and someone will have to step forward and finance it. And it's one of those process issues that the public doesn't respond well to. So as much as I'd like to see it, I don't know how much political capital we want to waste on it, when now that we've got the building blocks in place for much more important legislation, like the payday loan stuff, that's still left on the table, that needs all the oomph you can have. And you might get a little bit, you might digress a little if you take that issue up. That one could take like 7 or 8 years of explaining, I think, to get it.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is about, we've been talking about a flood of bills getting through, but when it comes to bills that challenge the New Mexico oil and gas industry, those bills don't get very far. And, the governor famously stated that I work for you at a New Mexico Oil and Gas Association breakfast. And there's evidence that maybe she does. What are your thoughts on that? And how, if you've got a governor, and I certainly understand that we get a lot of money from them, but at some point we have to start paying attention to the fact that methane is going to choke our earth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I wrote extensively back in July of 2018, when the governor gave a kind of famous or infamous interview, if you will, with the Albuquerque newspaper, and was asked about the environmental movement focusing on the southeastern New Mexico oil fields and the talk of no fracking and shutting down it. And she says, well, they're crazies, And I said, oh, you might have used the wrong word there, with a lot of people who don't feel they're crazy, but are just intent about the environment. But she's a very centrist governor. And I think she's taking a holistic view of the state. Oil and gas is part of the citizenry. It's part of the industry. It deserves a seat at the table. The problem you have, of course, as you point out, is the climate change also has to have that seat at the table. We're kind of caught in a little bit of a paradox here. Look at, I mean, the oil and gas industry needs to be responsible, but I don't want to see the oil and gas industry suddenly not plowing that money into the permanent fund and into the capital outlay and the severance tax fund, because all of us have ideas on how we can use that money to improve the state of our government, particularly the desperately needed funds for education and for reforming education. I mean, look at the Yazzie Martinez suit. How are we going to pay for that? We should have actually done it out of the reserves this year. That's another story. But to bring our schools up to constitutional standard, I mean, that's pretty desperate that we're in that situation. And right now we're getting 35 or 40% of our state revenue from oil and gas. So you can see the conundrum that even a lot of progressive people have, like, well, we'll talk about that, but first let's make sure we keep the money coming in so we can pay our staffs, we can fund our departments correctly and take care of people. On the other hand, I do think we made a little progress lately, Paul, with the methane regulations I was reading about. It seemed to be a compromise, and it was getting some praise. I'm not real read up on it, but I think that the governor and environmental groups were working together, and the oil and gas industry, and they were both they were saying that the bill was the real deal, that it would contribute to less methane. As far as fracking and banning fracking, I think that's the wrong question. That's not going to pass. No one in New Mexico is going to say, just stop the fracking. We have to work on making the fracking more effective, more environmentally safe. And I think that's all possible. I don't see the oil and gas industry really running amok in New Mexico. I think that they have a very powerful group in New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, but I understand the governor's trepidation. I don't think I'm answering the question, so I'll be quiet, because it's one of those questions that you really have. It's a great question, and it brings up so many streams of thoughts for our state and it's important to talk about for sure.
Yeah, and I just want to mention, because Zuby Wilson, who's an attendee, had put in the chat that it's not like the oil and gas industry is giving us money. They make millions, if not billions of dollars by extracting our resources from, and from our land. So just wanted to clarify that. We all know that. So, but we do depend on that money. So we need to make a transition for sure.
Hi, Zuby. I've been on his radio show. Good to have him with us.
What's that?
I just said hello to Mr. Wilson. I've been on his radio show.
Oh, okay. Great.
Good to have him with us. Always a pleasure.
All right. So
this will be our last question from us, and then we'll
go on to the.
I see some questions there.
Yeah. So this year, obviously, the session was very different because of COVID, and there was some silver linings there in terms of people could watch hearings via webcast, they could participate via Zoom. But also, so we always have like hundreds, if not a couple thousand people emailing legislators to ask them to support bills or to tell them what issues they care about and that sort of thing. But somewhere mid-session, we heard, the legislators are getting way too many emails. They're overwhelmed. They're not even reading them. So I don't know how true that was, but in general, what do you think is the best approach? Email, phone calls, maybe even developing a relationship earlier on with your legislator and talking to him during the year instead of just waiting for the session?
What you just said, Roxanne, rings so true, because veteran lobbyists I've talked to often talk about, I don't like to bother them during the session as little as possible. I want to lay the groundwork before I go in, meet with them, coffee out in Clovis, talk to them about their family, their businesses, whatever, throughout the year. And I think these veteran lobbyists are pretty good at getting results. And I think that applies to volunteers and regular citizens too, that you kind of lay the groundwork prior to the session, because imagine in your own life, you have you get frazzled. You got, you got to handle your personal life. You're up there at the legislature. You're driving back and forth. You've got all these bills, all these conflicting meetings, and so they can get frazzled towards the end. I think in the beginning of the session would be probably an easier time to get a hold of them, don't you think? And say, hey, this is coming up. This is where we stand. We're going to be testifying. We don't want to have to harangue you, but you have a better chance to get a good hearing during those early days. And then, as you said, Roxanne, throughout the process. And I think people forget that. It's not all at the roundhouse, it's away from the roundhouse too, the process.
Right, right.
So we have a question here from
Oh.
Rosella Gonzalez.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to, just so people know what we're doing, we're moving on now to the attendee Q&A, and I like to do them in the order they came in, but Paul's gonna jump around first, so go ahead.
Well, I'm
since you-
jumping in here because I know that in an exchange with Joe, he wanted to talk about the election. So Rosella Gonzalez asked, Melanie Stansbury's Democratic Party Central Committee CD1 nomination was quite an upset. What is your take on what accounts for this, given that Cedillo Lopez was endorsed by Progressive Democrats of America and New Mexico Working Party
And the Atlantic
and
Caucus.
Atlantic Caucus? Also, your thoughts on what this means for the chances of Democrats holding this seat, given that Stansbury is running against a Hispanic mix former Lobo athlete? How about that?
Let's talk about Mark
I
Morris.
got the first part of the question, and the internet went unstable on me. The first part was, what did I make of the upset by Cedillo Lopez? Yeah, that was a big upset. She won the plurality in the first round of voting over Stansbury, and then Stansbury pulled out all the stops with these late endorsements and an appeal that she would be a stronger contender. And she pulled off the upset. It was the men in the state central committee, by the way, who went for Stansbury 60% for Stansbury over Lopez in the second round. And I carried that on my blog at joemonahan.com, some of the demographics that kind of switched over in the runoff. There's probably a bunch of reasons. It's so small, 200 people, and a lot of it was likability and energy. And the seat does have a history of sending younger people there. I mean, Manuel Lujan back in the day was 40 years old. Martin Heinrich was barely 40. Heather Wilson was young. I think her youth and energy might have helped her in that final push when a lot of these state central committee people are pragmatists. They want to make sure you win that seat. Not that it's really in play, but in a special election, you put up a candidate who you might think's a little more vulnerable. You might get second thoughts. Back in '98, they had that disaster up north when Congressman Bill Redmond materialized, a Republican for the first time in history in the Northern District, because they had a damaged Democratic candidate by the name of Eric Cerna and a Green Party candidate won, splitting the vote and letting the Republican win. So I think these were seasoned pros, and they said, geez, Stansbury's got the energy, she's got the ideas, she may not be a woman of color. There was some discussion of that. But I think that's what put her over the top, was good old fashioned. We think she can hold this seat, and that's our job here at the State Central Committee. And they gave.
Well, the second part of the question, Joe, that you didn't hear was, what do you think of her chances in the final in the election, given that she'll be running against a Hispanic mix former Lobo athlete who is somewhat popular in his community?
Well,
he's the only Republican who's ever been on this Zoom.
On one of our Zooms.
Well, funny you should ask, because I discussed that today, and I have some fun with my readers and saying, well, I'm going to rank this race. Is it, lean Democratic, solid Democratic, lean Republican, or solid Republican? I rank the seat solid Democrat. Among the reasons, no Republican has been elected to the seat since 2006. The closest race we had since then by the Republicans was during the Tea Party year of 2010. We've just come off an election in November of 2020 where President Biden, then candidate Biden, carried the district by 61%. That was the biggest win for a presidential candidate in this congressional district in Albuquerque in history. In fact, for the first time in history, the Albuquerque district outvoted the North for the Democratic presidential candidate. And we all know how Santa Fe and Taos vote heavily Democratic. Also, I don't think the Hispanic credentials really translate to Mr. Moore's. It's the first we're really hearing about it in his lengthy political career. All of a sudden you have this, have that. And the UNM Lobo spot I thought was really male oriented. And then I wrote on the blog, you know, he's got a real problem with Aubrey Dunn. The former state land commissioner apparently will qualify for the ballot. He has a TV spot that I've received today where he hits all these conservative themes. And it's pretty evident to me, Paul and Roxanne, that that vote may be split. And in a perfect, they need a perfect night, the Republicans, to take the election. Another reason I think that Stansbury will win is that traditionally Democrats lose in New Mexico when there's a corruption meme, because most of the public agrees with the Democratic philosophy, whatever it may be, conservative or progressive or whatever. They register Democrat and they vote Democrat. But as we saw with Diane Dennis, when she tried to succeed Bill Richardson, she was defeated because there was a taint on the corruption issue. And we saw that with Gary Johnson back when he was reelected governor. So Republicans need a little help from the candidate. And in the case of Stansbury, no such meme or no such situation has arisen. So I think she's positioned quite strongly, and I expect her to take the seat. Another reason, finally, is that I think the Democrats will do everything they can nationally to pump resources into it to keep the seat. And I don't think the Republicans are as committed to keeping the seat because of the aforementioned reasons I gave of their uphill battle.
Okay. Well, I'm going to combine two questions here. Janet Warner and Lisa Franz, and they're both related to the governor. And what Janet is asking is, how much influence does the governor really have in terms of what bills get introduced, what, you know, how the votes fall and that sort of thing. And then is it normal, quote unquote normal, this is Lisa's question, for the governor to be signing so many bills at the very last minute with just like a day or so to go?
Yeah, I'll take the last part first. It's normal for them to do that. They have this window to do it, and they generally roll it out, and they like to get a lot of publicity. You get 2 press releases a day. It's kind of time for their image to reassert their gubernatorial authority. And obviously, Michelle Lujan Grisham is doing that this week. As far as her role in introducing the bills in the legislation, well, yeah, I mean, she's the governor, and she used the governorship quite effectively in the special session where she got this marijuana bill through after it was not defeated, but stalled out in the Senate. So she's a key player. She's more of a key player now because you can go back when John Arthur Smith was chairman of the Senate Finance. She went down there twice to testify in favor of the constitutional amendment for early childhood and got the brush off. So, when you have a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature, or vice versa, Republican governor, Republican legislature, you're going to see that power go up to the 4th floor pretty rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have gridlock right now, so I think it makes for a more powerful governor.
Okay, great, thank you.
So we have one from Joyce Westerberg. The Republican Party is at a crossroads. Which way do you think they might go? Will it follow the untruthful, insurrectionist, and unconstitutional path? Votes beckon, but truth, justice, and the American way lie in the other direction.
Well, I mean, it's really a question that keeps me up at night, not very late, but up at night a little bit. I'm very worried about it. I'm very worried about our Republican Party. I worked for a Republican congressman. I'm from northeastern Pennsylvania, where we had what we called Rockefeller Republicans back in the day, which was more liberal Republicanism. Senator Margaret Chase Smith goes way back. And we've lost in New Mexico the Pete Domenici, Manuel Lujan wing of that party. For some of our veteran observers, they know those names. And we've gotten a party that's more cultish, more personality oriented, and more Trump oriented. I don't think Mark Morse, for example, is part of that. But if you look at his Facebook page where he put up his TV spot and asked for support, there's a bunch of comments there that he's a rhino, Republican in name only. We don't need a fake Republican. So they're having a very tough time bringing it together. There's been some really good articles written about whether the Republican Party will even stay around. Maybe it'll adopt another name. Some authors saying that, well, if you look at the Whigs became whatever they became, the Republicans, and we've had changes of parties over the centuries, that they're in such a pickle that we could see the party evolve into something different. But certainly in New Mexico, which I think I can speak of based on experience, we need a moderate strain of republicanism to bring, I mean, they're wiped out, Roxanne and Paul. They don't hold any executive offices in the state, auditor, treasurer, et cetera. Both chambers of the legislature are now controlled by Democrats, and the conservative coalition in the Senate, where at least they had some power, is busted. The governor is a Democrat. The 2 US senators are a Democrat. There's one lone Republican congresswoman who very well may be redistricted out of her seat. They have nothing on the Supreme Court now that Judy Nakamura has gone. Talk about an existential crisis. I think that's the definition right there. They are not getting people elected, and they're not doing their job because their philosophy it's marginalized. The powerful group in that party represents a small portion of the public. And until they get back to a more mainstream way of thinking, I'm afraid what happens to the Republic, look what happened in California to the Republicans. Now it's happening here. So I don't have the answer, except that I know they need a shakeup and they need a new direction, and they need to cut that umbilical cord with the previous Republican president and start talking about the issues that we're talking about on this panel tonight. Even if people on this in this audience don't agree with the Republicans' philosophy, guys, at least they would appreciate them joining the conversation. Right now, they're not even in the conversation.
Yeah, it's hard to have a conversation with the
It's difficult,
Republicans.
and I don't think we should kick them when they're down, because we need the countervailing points. I mean, that's what keeps people honest, you know, in the
Yep.
democratic process. And as I said earlier, the Democrats have had a lot of problems with losing elections because the temptations of power are always there, no matter what party or what your political philosophy is. And that abuse leads to election of a Republican. I still think that can happen. But as far as a robust, you know, power, like when they took over the State House 6 years ago, I think for the next 10 years, they got to start rebuilding.
We'll try and keep that from happening.
So here's a question from Eric Shimamoto. Maybe you know Eric.
Hi, Eric. I sure do. Great guy.
Do you think that Daniel Ivey Soto will still keep his chairmanship when the Senate reconvenes? And I don't know whether he's referring to the quote unquote bullying charges or not, but
Well, it doesn't look like Mimi and he are kissing and making up at this point. And
No, it
since
doesn't.
she is the pro tem, is it common for a pro tem to change the committee assignments after having done so, you know,
Midterm, yeah.
midterm?
Well, Eric can answer his own questions because he's an expert at it, more so than most of us here. But thanks for asking me, and I'll give you my opinion. That most of the time that as I've seen it play out, the president pro tem's peak power is in the beginning when he or she takes power, because that's when they have their power over who will be the major committee players. In this case, it arises that if this feud continues, would she make a move to shake up the chairmanship? I don't think so. I don't think it would be the thing to do because it's too personal at this point. I think, as I wrote on the blog, it's really time to make the peace. Daniel Ivey Soto was accused of bullying and bullying behavior and abusive behavior on the floor of the Senate when they were debating the sick paid leave bill for people who are not familiar with what happened. And Senator Stewart refused to yield any more to him after a series of questions because of what she felt was the bullying and intimidation factor. But if you look at the tape, and a lot of people did, there's kind of a mixed review. And I think Eric saw that too. Not everybody said, yeah, this was abusive behavior. I mean, he's a lawyer who asks like he's in the courtroom, and anybody who's been in a courtroom can know that they can be pretty rough and intimidating. But having said that, Senator Stewart didn't see it that way, and neither did Senator Stefanik or Senator Padilla and a number of her colleagues. So there's some real patchwork to be done there. I think really fundamentally, though, to what's important is not this personality dispute, but what does this mean to our governance right now in this point in history? And I think what it shows to me, and I don't know if Eric would agree, but I see the power shift in the legislature moving over to the House. They've got stronger leadership under Egoff. Now, he started off a little rocky. You know, the first year or two, he had that coalition, and then certain legislators from the North who didn't really support him are gone. And I think he's done a pretty good job of shepherding and stuff. The thing I look for in a political leader is not whether I agree with him all the time, but are you growing and learning in the job? That's the highest compliment I can pay to a politician, because most, I can't say without a dispute that this is a good person or a bad person, but I can tell if a person is growing in a job. And Egoff is growing. Patricia Lundstrom, as chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, is growing. Javier Martinez and Mo Maestas are two go-go Democratic legislators. Can you name in the Senate? Can you name in the Senate the powerhouses? They're gone because they were taken out in that June primary election. So I think this left the Senate with a weaker leadership structure and less oomph to enforce an Ivy Soto going astray. To finish it up, why would you let the guy go 30 minutes if it was abusive? If you had power there, you would just say, Mr. Soto, we're taking a break. Mr. Ivy, so we're taking a break. There was nobody interrupting it, and it kind of unraveled in an unseemly way. Whereas the House, the trains were running on time. And one other point, all the major legislation just about that was passed in this session of the legislature originated in the House. All of it. It's been there for 7 or 8 years. There was, including marijuana, land grant permanent fund, tax credits, et cetera.
It's interesting. It's interesting. Got another one, Roxanne?
Yeah, okay, I'm scrolling down to find.
Maybe while she's looking, we had left out one of our questions. How about, I've been told many times that decisions about bills are largely made during the interim hearings. But the hearings can extend for 2 or 4 days. The agendas are not always posted real early. And they don't always take public comment. In fact, they often don't take public comment. So if that's where the sausage gets made, how do we get our hands on the sausage?
I kind of missed the first part of that due to the instability factor here. Sorry, Paul, could you repeat that?
The interim hearings are supposed to be where the sausage gets made. The bills that are discussed there are the ones that wind up making it through in the session. And so since there aren't a lot of times where you can offer public comment during interim hearings, how can citizen advocates or public advocates have an impact on the interim session and maybe get some of the bills that they would like to see move forward?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Roxanne brought up about talking to the legislators, forming those relationships during the off season, trying to go to the interim committees, and which I think we should have more of, by the way. I think we could have used it for the marijuana, the panel that the governor convened. I think we still didn't get the bill that we needed, a clean bill without a lot of questions hanging over as the newspapers around the state have editorialized. But yeah, it's difficult to get into these interim committees when they're held at Ruidoso, Clayton, or wherever. And that the point of that is to spread the legislative process around.
Right.
That's why they're held out there. But it's a great opportunity, though, for your folks in those towns to be aware and to see if they can go. Of course, they're during the day, and then maybe we might want to hold some of those committee hearings on the weekends in the summer when legislators are free too, would be a suggestion, just to be able to get more people involved that way, because the business day is difficult. And then in the cold winter months, it's often an issue too. So it would just be 2 little practical suggestions.
Okay, great. So Karen Nelson is asking if you support a public bank, but I guess probably the bigger question, and you can tell us your personal opinion, but do you think the public bank has a chance of getting through? We've been supporters of public banking for quite some time. We were in part of the movement here to try to start one in Santa Fe. But it seems to be moving pretty slowly in the legislature. And this makes me think about something I think Peter Wirth told Paul. Oh, you got to introduce and reintroduce an idea like 2, 3, 4, or 5 years in a row for it to really finally take off. Of course, it took 30 years for health security, and we don't wish that upon anyone. But
well, I hope we have 30 years left. I mean, that's getting long in the tooth to pass something. But well, I confess, on the public bank, I was contacted by the public relations people for the public bank, and I wanted to do the story, and I just never got around to it. I did a little investigating and also found out what Senator Wirth said, that this thing doesn't have a great chance of passing. I think South Dakota is still the only one with a public bank. But look at the public. I would support I think I would support a public bank. But more importantly, we are kind of getting into the piggy bank a little. Via rather that land grant permanent fund amendment to get funds for early childhood, and it also has a 0.5%, I believe, for public education. So I think we're getting the change that a public bank would bring. We're getting more investment with this legislature and administration in investing in people and in investing in our system. So it's the goal of it is elusive, but the practical consequences, I think, are starting to turn. The wheel is slowly starting to turn to have more of this money invested, this massive amount of money that we have in capital outlay and severance tax, land grant permanent fund invested in the state. And that's why this passage of this constitutional amendment was so landmark and historic. I think it signals that that shift, that New Mexicans want to start using their own resources to correct this 49th and 50th problem.
Yeah, that's great.
So we have a question from Robert Libby. What is your opinion of Senator Joseph Cervantes? Is he the new John Arthur Smith?
The new Dr. No.
The new Dr. No. I don't think Joe would appreciate that. Well, you know, look at senators. Someone laughed at me on the chat when I called Cervantes erudite. Actually, he's very bright. I mean, I think it is a proper word. You may not agree with him, but he was brilliant in those hearings at 2 a.m. that when we were up watching them on the marijuana. I mean, he went to work on that as a practiced attorney, and with 30 years experience, he knows how to do it. Now, whether you agree with him or not is, but personally, I don't think he's going to, I don't think he's a Dr. No. I think he wants to get things done. I think he voted for the progressive position, I think, on a lot of other legislation. But there were 100 bills, I'm told, tied up there. But the New Mexico Civil Rights Act, which I was not real clear on and still aren't, that passed the Judiciary Committee. Right. Senator Cervantes let the marijuana bill go through, okay? I mean, you can't knock him for opposing it, but when he saw he didn't have the votes, he said, I don't think this is going to work. This is not the right thing for New Mexico, but he let it go. So I think that he gets off the hook a little for some of the hits he's been taking. You know, he's the chairman of the committee, and, you know, you're not going to, again, we go back to the fact that he paid his dues. He was in the House for many years. He's an accomplished attorney. He's been in the Senate for a number of years. He knows his stuff. His colleagues put him there for a reason, including some, progressive colleagues. But I think it's healthy to have not a Dr. No, but a Dr. Maybe. And I think Cervantes is kind of a Dr. Maybe.
Okay, great.
Here's from another question from Karen Nelson. Do you think Senator Candelaria will be running for governor? He certainly seems to be.
Well, he's had a very peripatetic public profile lately, if I could use the 3 Ps there. I don't know if Senator Candelaria will be running for governor. There's been talk about him possibly running for attorney general, actually, which is the seat that's up. That seat is up next year. But I do think that he, is obviously very well educated and polished on the issues when he speaks. The marijuana issue kind of sidetracked him a little when it was reported that one of his clients was Duke Rodriguez, who's the major player at Ultra Health, which is the major pharmacy, medicinal pharmacy for marijuana. I botched that, but you guys know what I mean. He's the key player in the marijuana industry. So Candelaria, and Speaker Egoff also was an attorney for him. They have to be careful with that stuff going forward. I sense a little bit more unease and intemperance in the public for that kind of citizen legislature activity. Well, we're just a citizen legislature. No, this is $1 billion industry with all kinds of ramifications. And they said they didn't need to recuse themselves, but there were a lot of people who I think said, no, on this one, let's do the right thing and recuse. But having said that, Senator Candelaria did a great job debating the land grant permanent amendment in the final act, and also he did a great job dissecting the marijuana. He obviously knew the issue. So, but as far as his political ambitions, I think they're probably confined more or less now to the Senate.
So I just have a little follow-up on that. Isn't there something that protects our legislators from this conflict of what would normally be called conflict of interest. They're not required to recuse themselves. It's just sort of like a personal decision. Is that right?
That's my understanding. And I saw Senator Candelaria and others get up. I want people to know that under this bill, I would not benefit. I'm one of my clients has an interest, but I do not believe I have a conflict of interest. And then they sat down and the debate went on.
Yeah. Okay, well, here's another, we've got about 5 minutes left.
Sure.
This question is from Rich Wiener, and he's asking, what do you think are the chances of significantly raising the personal income tax that was cut by Richardson and the corporate income tax that was cut by Martinez? And what do you see, how can we achieve that, if that's possible?
It wouldn't be a Zoom if we didn't have Rich asking about taxes.
Yeah, that's one of his favorite subjects.
Well, Rich, I'm a sympathizer. I've been pounding the table on that issue for a long time on my blog at joemonahan.com. And this was not the year for it. With the pandemic and all the other issues facing us, this was not the year for it. But it could have been the year, it could have been done a couple of years ago. But Governor Richardson did a heck of a lot of positive things for the state. I think he made a mistake on this one when he was running for president back in the early part of the century. He wanted to be more middle of the road Democrat, more Clintonian, if you will, which was the flavor of the day. And he passed these big personal income tax cuts through the legislature. Governor Martinez is the one, with the help of Democrats in the House, who passed the corporate income tax around 6 or 7 years ago, when the legislature had actually run out of time, but they decided to ignore the clock. The personal income tax doesn't need to be onerous, but we need those tax cuts cost New Mexico $350, $400 million a year. We wouldn't have had deficits in some years because of the oil crash if we had kept our personal income tax structure the way it had been. I think we need to gradually adjust and go up. I think there is a chance for that, but I got to tell you, that is one tough cookie. If the Republicans have done a good job on anything, it is demonizing taxation. It is tough, even for Democrats, to support firmly taxation. They get a lot of feedback in their district. The people who vote tend to have higher incomes. But I think that this again goes back to what Paul was saying with quoting Senator Worth. You keep chipping away. This is like a 4 or 5 year deal. Right now, New Mexico fiscally is in a sweet spot. We're in a great spot. The federal government is showering us with money. The oil price is back to $60 a barrel. The economy seems to be recovering. So I don't think there's the impetus for the tax reform right now, but it will come when we get into more rocky road fiscally, which inevitably happens in these cycles, my opinion.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you. We're pretty much out of time, and we really appreciated your insights. We at one point had 103 folks on.
Wow.
And so you're a popular man.
I think they're popular.
So if people, can people subscribe to your blog, or do they just go and read it online?
They just go there. They can bookmark me at joemonahan.com. I generally blog 4 or 5 times a week about the issues that we talked about here. And what I like about it is I get a lot of great reader email, like these great questions tonight. And then I can put that out there. I think the blog does a good job, if I could toot my own horn, at exposing like these questions about personal income taxes and the other questions that we dealt with today about, citizen activism, how it gets involved, and that LFC question about, why do they turn conservative? So join me if you're into that stuff. And of course, I joined Paul at Retake on his blog, especially during the session when he's got that sausage grinder out there talking about what's going on. So yeah, you can find me at joemonahan.com and on various radio and TV appearances. And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. You put me through my paces, I'll tell you that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And I think everybody who was on tonight does as well.
Yeah, and this has been recorded and will be posted on our website tonight or tomorrow. And
so if you know someone who missed it, it'll be up on the website.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good
Yeah.
night.
Thank you,
Thank you.
attendees.
Thanks, everybody. Have a
Bye-bye.
good night.